Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves learning, specifically classical conditioning. Now, if you watched my sort of introduction to learning, you probably learned that classical conditioning is not something that we're overly familiar with. And that is indeed true. We're very familiar with operant conditioning, where behavior is controlled by its consequences. And it's a lot easier for us to understand. But when we're talking about connecting events, this isn't something we don't do. This isn't something that we do consciously, and so therefore it's a lot harder for us to grasp in many ways. So I'm going to go through this very slowly and repeat things several times, mostly because I want to make sure that you understand this. So classical conditioning, as I mentioned in the original, in the sort of the orientation lecture, was discovered by a researcher called Ivan Pavlov. Now, Pavlov was not a psychologist. There actually wasn't really a field of psychology at the time. He was a physiologist. He was studying digestion. And he actually won a Nobel Prize for his work, not in psychology, but in digestion. Specifically at this time, he was studying the first part of digestion, which starts in the mouth. You put food in your mouth, chew it with your teeth, you start to break it down that way, mixes with saliva. Saliva also starts to break the food down sort of chemically, and then you swallow it and it goes on from there. So he was studying salivation. He was studying what I like to call drooling. And he was studying it in dogs, because dogs are fairly world champion droolers. What he was doing is he was giving dogs, for instance, a measured amount of dried meat that had been ground to a powder. He liked to use ground meat powder because the dogs liked it. It was very easy to measure and to weigh, and it kept for a long time. And so he would give them, say, 1 gram of meat powder, and he would measure how much saliva they produced. But he noticed something interesting. He noticed that some of the dogs were salivating before they got the food, which should have been impossible, because salivating is a reflex. It's not something we have control over. You put food in your mouth, you salivate, right? If I put lemon juice in your mouth, you would salivate. It's not like you can say to yourself, I'm not going to drool, and it won't happen. Or with no food in your mouth, you say, I'm going to drool, and it happens. Okay? It's a reflex. And reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord, and reflexes, for the most part, can't be created or overruled. But these dogs were doing it. These dogs were drooling before they got the food. Some of them were drooling right before they got the food. They were given the food by a machine, and the machine would make certain noises before it gave them the food, and they would start to drool then. There were even dogs that were drooling when they heard the person walking to the machine to turn it on. This should not have been happening. And this is when Pavlov showed that he indeed was a great scientist and not just a good one. Because instead of saying, as he very well could have, instead of saying, well, this is an extraneous variable, it's screwing up my experiment, and I need to get rid of it, he said the Russian equivalent of, this is cool. What the heck is this? I'm going to look at this for a while. This is pretty neat. And he began to study what he called psychic reflexes, but what we now call classical conditioning. Now, I'm going to give you a definition of classical conditioning. This sucker is quite a plateful. You may want to pause this to write it down, and I'm going to go through it essentially word for word, explaining it in just a minute. Told you that was a mouthful. It'll make sense once we break it down, like most things do. So we're talking, it's learning a response to a neutral stimulus when that neutral stimulus is paired with a stimulus that causes a reflex response. To start out with, we have stimulus and response. Now, I simplify this a bit. If you take a learning class, you're going to get this in a whole lot more detail. But generally, I say that a stimulus is some kind of event in the environment. Okay? A stimulus is some kind of event in the environment. A response is a reflex behavior. Okay, when we're talking classical conditioning, it's always a reflex. It's always something that you don't have control over. It's a reflex behavior. Okay, it's involuntary. So a stimulus is an event in the environment, response is an involuntary behavior. Now, something that is neutral doesn't cause any sort of response. It doesn't mean anything. It's just there. It's just part of the scenery. It's not something to be noticed. It's not something to be reacted to. It just kind of is. And for those dogs, at the beginning, say the sound of the machine giving them meat powder the first couple of times meant nothing, absolutely nothing. It was just another sound. But then eventually they learn to respond to it. So we have learning a response, learning a reflex behavior to a neutral stimulus, to a stimulus that doesn't mean anything. When that neutral stimulus is paired with a non-neutral stimulus, essentially. When you pair something that means nothing with something that means something, with some sort of stimulus that causes a reflex response, then eventually the individual is going to learn to respond to that neutral stimulus, and that neutral stimulus is not going to be neutral anymore. The sound of the machine meant nothing until it was paired over and over again with food. Sound of the machine, food, drool. Sound of the machine, food, drool. Sound of the machine, food, drool. And eventually, they learn to respond to the sound of the machine. They learn to drool to the sound of the machine. Why? Because the sound of the machine told them that food was coming. Now remember, this is, I mention it, I talk about it like it's a conscious thing. Like the dogs are thinking, oh look, food's going to be coming, I better start drooling. No, that isn't how it works, okay? This is all on a reflex level, on a subconscious level, okay? For humans as well as for dogs. But you do eventually can learn to respond to something simply because that something is associated with something else. Okay? Now, I'm actually going to go through all of these parts. And I'm going to break down, because all of these responses and all of these stimuli each have their own name. And the nice thing is they're named exactly what they are. And the other nice thing is they follow a pattern. So what you might want to do once I've gone through this is maybe go back and listen to that first definition a bit. It might make more sense. And look at examples of classical conditioning to make sure that it makes sense. Now, the important terms, there are 4 of them. The first is called an unconditioned stimulus, usually abbreviated UCS, but sometimes it's also abbreviated US. Okay? Now, a stimulus we've already talked about. A stimulus is an event in the environment. And conditioning, of course, means learning associations. So if something is unconditioned, it means that it's unlearned. And an unconditioned stimulus is some sort of event in the environment that naturally and automatically causes a reflex response. It's something in the environment that naturally and automatically causes a reflex response. It's meat powder for a dog. You put meat powder in a dog's mouth, it's going to drool. It's lemon juice in a human. I put lemon juice in your mouth, you're going to drool. It's thunder. If a loud sound comes out of nowhere, you're going to feel fear. It's, if you feel pain, you're going to feel fear. It's something that you don't have to learn. It's something that causes this response the first time that you experience it. Okay? So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that's unlearned. Unconditioned response. An unconditioned response is a behavior. A response is a behavior. You see how I'm breaking this down? Break it all down. A response is a reflex behavior that is unconditioned. UCR or UR for abbreviation. So it's a response that isn't learned. It's a response, a reflex response, that is naturally and automatically triggered by an unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus always causes an unconditioned response. Always. Always. An unconditioned stimulus causes an unconditioned response. They're both, they always do. If you put meat powder in a dog's mouth, that dog is going to drool. The meat powder is an unconditioned stimulus. The drooling is an unconditioned response. Make sure you get stimulus and response correct. Sometimes people say drooling is a stimulus. No, it isn't. I mean, it could be, but let's not go there. That's a little complicated now. Okay? Put meat powder in a dog's mouth, it's going to drool. Meat powder is an unconditioned stimulus. Drooling is an unconditioned response. Now, Pavlov, once he found that dogs were drooling to things that weren't meat powder, he wanted to know whether or not he could do this deliberately. Could he train a dog to drool to something other than meat powder? Could he control these psychic reflexes? So he got himself a bell. And he got himself some new dogs, because you can't really reuse dogs for these things. So he got himself some nice fresh dogs. And he took those dogs and he rang the bell and he gave them meat powder. And they drooled. Bell, meat powder, drool. Bell, meat powder, drool. Bell, meat powder, drool. Bell, meat powder, drool. Okay? The meat powder and the drool, that's an unconditioned stimulus. Meat powder automatically causes drooling. But then, after a long time of bell, meat powder, drool, he rang the bell and the dogs drooled. They didn't drool to food, they drooled to the bell. Conditioned stimulus. A stimulus, remember, is an event in the environment, like a bell ringing. Conditioned means that it's learned. So, it's some event that used to be neutral, a stimulus that used to be neutral, and now isn't. That bell had been neutral to the dogs. The dogs did not automatically drool when you ring a bell at them. If you have a dog, go ring a bell at it. You know, it's not going to do anything except look at you like, why are you ringing that bell? Okay? But because Pavlov's dogs had heard bell, got meat powder, drooled. Bell, meat powder, drool. Bell, meat powder, drool. They began to respond to the bell. The bell became a conditioned stimulus because it had been paired over and over and over again with an unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder. So the bell, which used to be neutral, is now a conditioned stimulus. And what does a conditioned stimulus cause? Look at the pattern. Conditioned response. The conditioned response here is a reflex response, reflex behavior, that's what response is, that has been learned. It's conditioned. And it's triggered by a conditioned stimulus. In the same way that an unconditioned stimulus always causes an unconditioned response, a conditioned stimulus always causes a conditioned response. In the case of the unconditioned stimulus and response, they are unlearned. In the case of the conditioned stimulus and response, they are learned. Do you see how you break that down? All you have to do to figure out whether something is any one of these, and I know I ask questions about that, is first of all, is it a behavior or is it an event in the environment? Because if it's a behavior, it has to be a response. And you can cross out the answers that say it's a stimulus, because it's not a stimulus. If it's a reflex behavior, it's a response. Or if it's an event in the environment, it can't be a behavior. It can't be a response. Cross those out. Once you've determined, once you look at the behavior, or the behavior of that event or whatever, once you've figured out that what you're being asked, is it a stimulus or a response? Secondly, is it learned or unlearned? Is it something that naturally and automatically causes the response, or is it something that has to be learned? If it naturally and automatically causes it, then it's unconditioned. If it has to be learned, then it's conditioned. Break these terms down and they will tell you what they are. Dogs automatically drool to meat powder. Unconditioned stimulus is the meat powder. Unconditioned response is drooling to the meat powder. It's always good to be precise. You'll find out in a minute why. The bell is the conditioned stimulus, which causes drooling caused by the bell. Notice that in both of those, the response is always drooling. How do you know whether that drooling is a conditioned or unconditioned? You look at what caused it. Was it caused by something that was learned? Then it has to be learned too. It has to be conditioned. Was it something that's triggered naturally and automatically? Then it's unconditioned. Break the terms down. Look at what the words mean and break them down, and they will tell you what they are. And when given an example, you should be able to pick these out by going, okay, is it an event or a behavior? Is it a stimulus or a response? And then, is it learned or unlearned? And that should give you the answer right there.